Come on. Okay, it's working. All right. For the benefit of those who are watching at home, we don't have any computer screen tonight. There's a problem with the account setting, but we'll make do, because this evening we are thankfully working on something that doesn't need a whole lot of screen time. We're going to be working on something out of the Siddur, out of the prayer book. You may remember, if you've been following along, that was someone else?
Somebody else.
Did someone else mind getting the door this time? Thank you. Just a quick recap. Last session, we went over having an aliyah, how to be called to the Torah and to be able to say the blessings and go through the various rituals that are involved on the bima, on that raised platform. We also, the week before that, talked about the structure of the service for the Torah reading, how we bring the Torah out, how we put the Torah back, the songs we sing, and why we sing them. Well, tonight I wanted to talk about the Friday night service, the Erev Shabbat service, also sometimes called Kabbalat Shabbat service, which is how we welcome Shabbat in the first place, how we greet Shabbat at the beginning of its entrance into our weekly schedule. You may remember that the idea of it's been for Jewish holidays is that a holiday begins with the beginning of night, the day before the date on the calendar. Everyone always seems to think that's weird. They're like, why do you start your holidays at nightfall? You know, everybody knows you start it in the daytime. But really, when does the calendar change on the secular calendar?
What?
When does the calendar change? When do you go from one day to the next day in a second? What? Midnight. Exactly. Right. So people should already be used to the idea that the day changes in the middle of the night. We just change it when people are still awake. Right. So we start off in the evening. Now, because Shabbat is so special, as are other holidays as well, rather than regular days, we don't wait until the official beginning of nightfall, which is when 3 stars are visible in the sky, if you could see stars in our sky. Certainly in the summer, we usually have too much cloud, but and light pollution as well. But instead, for Shabbat and other holidays, we begin a few minutes before sundown even, in order to make sure that there is a buffer between the beginning of our Shabbat and the official legal beginning of the day, because we don't want to be caught late on Shabbat. Make sense? Okay. But
Mostly because lighting.
well, the lighting the candles is the most powerful symbol of something that we must do before Shabbat begins, right? Because once Shabbat begins, we're not striking matches. We're not making fire on Shabbat itself. So in order to have light on Shabbat, you have to prepare before Shabbat. And that's really sort of a running theme throughout all of our Shabbat observance, is that in order for Shabbat to be special and to be wonderful, you have to prepare before it happens. And if you don't prepare before it happens, don't be surprised if Shabbat is not as beautiful as it could be. It's sort of like if you are going to go on a vacation, speaking personally, having just gone on vacation, if you're going to go somewhere new, you should probably take a little time to prepare for your trip before you arrive, right? Maybe check out a little bit online about what's this place like. Maybe even book a hotel. Maybe even figure out how am I going to get from the airport to my hotel. These are things that you might want to do before you land in the new place. Same thing with Shabbat. Is once you land, your weekday currency isn't good anymore, right? You can't spend the normal things that you would do. You're not going to go buying stuff. You're not going to go building stuff. You're not going to go cooking stuff. So you have to plan in advance. Now, that is actually a great segue, unintended, but your questions often help make good connections of how we end up with the Shabbat service that we now have. Because the Shabbat service we now have is the product of a historical development. It did not come like this back when we were at the base of Mount Sinai. The service we have now has evolved over the centuries. And we're going to talk about how that process came to be. Everyone still with me? Okay. So the service has a few main points. There is technically a part that is called Kabbalat Shabbat, which literally means the welcoming or the greeting of Shabbat. That is followed customarily by a little bit of study. And then that is followed by the Mariv service. A Mariv service is an evening service, which can be on Shabbat, holidays, or weekdays. And then, of course, there are concluding prayers. And this may feel a little bit familiar. Apart from the Kabbalat Shabbat period part, most services have Mariv, have the main section of prayers, and then there is a concluding section as well. The Kabbalat Shabbat part is the part that is unusual. The idea that we would need to welcome Shabbat is very ancient. The idea that Shabbat wasn't just something you were supposed to say, oh, look, it's Shabbat, but that you were actively going out to welcome Shabbat by preparing your house, lighting the candles, getting the dinner ready, all those kinds of, that we've been doing for a few thousand years. But putting it together into a service with a special selection of psalms and a special selection of poems, that is something that is relatively recent in Jewish history. It's only about 500 years old. I know, it's twice the age of the United States, but that's recent by the Jewish measure. So about 500 years ago, in the community of Tzfat, which is in northern Israel, up in the Galil, the people who were there began to develop these practices of not only singing these songs and choosing to recite these psalms, but to also even go out into the fields, go out onto the hillside and watch as Shabbat approached. Now, how does Shabbat approach? You can watch the darkness just gently flowing over the hillsides. And so this was a very personal and a very personified version of Shabbat. Shabbat becomes seen as the Kala, as the bride, as being this wonderful guest that is joining us and joining with us in a mystical sense, in a very beautiful way. And so they would literally go out to greet. They would literally sing these songs as though you were greeting a revered guest, a queen, a bride, and they made Shabbat very, very beautiful in this way. And that's the section we're going to look at first. Good? Good. Look at page 5. If you look at the bottom of page 5, you'll see a little poem called Shalom Aleichem. Now, this poem is sometimes sung at home after you've returned from services, and in some communities it's also sung at the synagogue at the beginning of services. Shalom Aleichem is literally saying peace to you. As we've discussed before, the translation of the titles of many Jewish prayers is usually a little boring because it's usually just the first couple words of the prayer. We didn't come up with fancy names for songs the way that you would in a modern rock system. So Shalom Aleichem is about greeting. But who are we greeting? Well, we're greeting what is known as the Malachei Hasharet, which literally means the serving angels. And this whole song is based on a concept that is related in the Talmud, where when a person is preparing for Shabbat, there are two angels. There is a good angel and a bad angel. We're going to come back to those labels in a second. And if everything is prepared well, the good angel says, may it be like this next week. And the bad angel has to say, Amen. And if everything is prepared badly, and it's all a mess and horrible and everybody's uncomfortable, then the bad angel says, may it be like this next week. And the good angel has to say, Amen. Okay, so obviously, as you'll have found out, in Jewish stories, it's never as simple as it sounds. Right? What do you mean good angels and bad angels? Is there such a thing as a bad angel? An angel is expression of God's will. Does God have bad parts of God's will? Absolutely not. So what are we talking about? We're talking about an angel or an expression or a manifestation of God that is trying to support and make things easier for us, and a manifestation that is trying to challenge us. Right now, challenges, most of us don't like. And so we consider them to be bad things. But the angel itself, they don't enjoy, they don't dislike, they don't have feelings. They are simply forces that make life easier and forces that put challenges in our way. And when you make Shabbat well, what happens, you'll find, is that Shabbat rejuvenates you, it inspires you, it allows you to have that spiritual connection to God. And that lets the next week be even better, which means by the time next Shabbat rolls around, it's even easier, right? So the following Shabbat almost becomes automatic if the current Shabbat is good. But if the current Shabbat is bad, then Shabbat doesn't really do its job for you as well as it could, which means next Shabbat, you won't be hitting Shabbat with as much enthusiasm and as much preparation, which means it's also more likely to not be as good as you'd want it to be. So the idea here is that how we make Shabbat has consequences beyond just Shabbat itself, this one day, right? What I do today will affect next week. What I do next week will affect the week after, and it has a cascade effect. So once Shabbat has gone badly, you're going to have to work harder to fix things in the middle. And once a Shabbat has gone well, you should expect things to be easier, but you still have to be on the job, right? It's not going to be automatic forever after that point. So this is really an idea that we are welcoming both parts because God has given us both support as well as challenges. And it's up to us to make sure that we make the most of it. Now, there's a traditional melody to this, and there are also many, many modern melodies. Let me just give you a quick example of the traditional melody because it's nice to know how things sound. So it goes more or less like this. And I apologize in advance that my throat is still recovering from a bit of an allergy attack in England. Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Hasharet, Malachi Elyon, Mi Melech, Malachi Hasharet, Malachi Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem l'shalom, Malachi Hashalom, Malachi Elyon. Mi melech malachi amlachim hakadosh baruch hu. And then the melody pattern continues for the final two stanzas. Other modern melodies as well, the idea is that we greet this gift of choice that God has given us with some enthusiasm, and we recognize that it is a gift of choice. Now, for those communities that don't begin with Shalom Aleichem, they will often begin with Yedid Nefesh, which, if you'll bear with me as I just find my page number here. Where did they hide Yedid Nefesh? Page 10, thank you. Yes, there we are, page 10. So Yedid Nefesh, as you can see, was written by Rabbi Elazar Azikri in around the late 1500s. There was some controversy over how it was written, that is to say, the specific grammar of some of the words, and many synagogues use Siddurim that are incorrect. How can we say that it's absolutely wrong? Because we have copies of the author's original writings. It's one of those beautiful things in the modern world of scholarship that sometimes they will discover manuscripts in the handwriting of the original person. And so the version that's in our Siddur is what the original author chose. Now, prayers do change, poems do change, and it's fine that other synagogues want to use different versions. And the reason it was changed, I sort of understand, because when he was writing this, the rabbi wrote in such a passionate way about the love between us and God and between us and Shabbat that he used very romantic language. And there are some people that were uncomfortable with the feminization that was occurring. And so they changed the words to make it more masculine. And so that ended up being version number 2. But we are using the original version because I think it happens to be beautiful, and so does the rest of the conservative movement. So Yedid Nefesh, again, there are many different melodies. Let me put this one into my focal range. The melody that I usually use goes like this. Yedid Nefesh Avarachaman Meshoch Avdach Eretzonach Yarutz Avdach Kemo Hayam Yishtachave Mul Hadarach Ki Yerav Lo Yedidutach Mino Fetzuf Vechol Taham, and so on in the same melody for each of the additional stanzas. Now, that, like I said, is an additional song. I know the English words are too close to each other. That is an additional song, a poem that was written in the late 1500s. When you turn the page to 11, however, we begin a cycle of psalms that, of course, were written a couple thousand years ago. We go from Psalm 95 through 99 with as being different markers for the 5 days of the week before a capstone psalm that will be for a sixth day. And this is really very much meant to be, is there someone else?
I saw like a car driving.
Okay, yeah, it's probably the parking lot next door. Just sometimes people can arrive late, but hopefully not this late. And these psalms were selected in order to give us a chance to meditate as we move through each day of the week towards a reflection of God's glory in creation, as well as God's position as a judge for all of the world, as God being the bringer of justice to all of the world. Now, why are these important concepts? Well, creation and the glory of God through the world, that makes perfect sense as a link to Shabbat. Shabbat is, after all, half a celebration of God's creation. 6 days God made the world, on the seventh day God rested. But Shabbat is also a celebration of justice, because Shabbat is a celebration of the liberation of us from Egypt, which was an act of freeing us, an act of bringing justice to the world. So the idea that God is seen in both aspects of the world through these set of psalms is very much an appropriate reflection of God being celebrated in Shabbat. Make sense? And each of these psalms have different songs that have been attached to them. Some communities will sing all of them. Some will chant them privately, each person to themselves. Some will just sing selections from these psalms. Like I said, this whole collection was only added to our Friday night service about 500 years ago. It has been more or less universally adopted by communities around the Jewish world, but there is still more flexibility here than there is in other parts of the service because it is relatively new by our standards. Any questions?
Okay. When they start the Erev Shabbat, they can either start with the Kabbalah Shabbat and that Shalom Aleichem, or
the Yedid Nefesh is also a common way to start Shabbat, or you can start from here with Lechu Neranena. That's the first song, the first few lines, what is it? The first 4 lines on page 11 are often sung as a song. It goes a little bit like this. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena ladonai. Lechu neranena, lechu neranena, lechu neranena ladonai. Naria, naria, letzur hishenu, nikadma fanav betoda. Naria, naria, letzur hishenu, Bismirot narialo lechuna, and then it repeats the opening line again. So that's another great place to start because the words themselves are saying, "Come and sing." Right? So it's a beautiful invitation to begin Shabbat with as well. But you'll notice that all of these different variations, Shalom Aleichem, Yedid Nefesh, Lechu Neranena, all of them separately or even together, are about getting us to be excited, enthusiastic, to be greeting Shabbat as a welcome partner, a welcome friend, a welcome dignitary. That Shabbat should not just come, schlumping into town. Shabbat needs to be embraced. And that is why this whole section was put together over those years to give us a structure for how we can greet Shabbat with more enthusiasm. Make sense? Okay, now, just as one example, at the end of page 12, there is something that we call nusach in the Jewish world. Nusach is not quite chanting, and it's not quite singing. It is in between. It is a set of melodies that are used to read a text in a way that gives it a flavor and a style that will match the mood of that particular service. So there's different nusach for Friday night, and different nusach for Saturday morning, and different nusach for Rosh Hashanah, and different nusach for Sukkot. there's a different melody group that's used for not quite chanting, not quite reading, not quite singing, but it gives a flavor overlay. Think of it like an Instagram filter for music for all of our prayers. So that way you get the right feel for the time. And so the one that's used for Kabbalat Shabbat in most communities, with some variation, goes like this. Arbahim shana akut bedo, va'omar am to'e levavhem, vehem lo yadu derachai, asher nishbati ve'api, im yevon el menuchati. Which, as you can hear, it's very gentle. It's meant to be very soft. It's warm and inviting and nice, so that you leave the week behind, right? That's the whole idea, is that it's supposed to be moving you from the week you've been working in to the Shabbat that you'll be resting in, and that you'll be leaving behind all of your worries, your troubles, and all the difficulties, and that will open you up to be a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit softer, so that you'll be able to experience Shabbat, God, and all the wonderful things that happen when those come together. Make sense? Okay, we're not going to go through all of the Psalms and all of the different songs that have been written and composed, but you'll see page 13 and page 15, Psalm 97, page 17 is Psalm 98, page 19 is Psalm 99. And in our service, we will do at least some of all of them. Sometimes we'll do the English, sometimes we'll do a song, and then we'll read the rest privately. Sometimes we'll sing the whole thing together. We do different variations to celebrate all of those different psalms, which brings us now to page 21. So page 21, we have Psalm 29, which we're breaking our pattern, right? But Psalm 29 is sort of the capstone psalm of experiencing God through creation, of experiencing God through the world around us. It specifically mentions the phrase Kol Adonai, which means the voice or the sound of Adonai, 7 times. 7, of course, is a magic number, 7 days of creation, and the 7th day itself is Shabbat. And the idea being that we can hear and experience God throughout the totality of creation. And the 6th day, of course, represents that final totality of creation. And so we sing Psalm 29 on Friday night in that sense. We're good? I'm not going to sing all of it because it's a long one. Ana Bakoach was added later as another mystical prayer. It's not one that we do in our community, so we're going to move on. Page 23, however, we get Shalom Aleichem. This is another song, another poem that was written in the 1500s and then has had 100 different musical variations put to it. Lechadodi is literally talking about greeting Shabbat as the bride. Come, my beloved, let us greet the bride. It was written by a man by the name of Shlomo Alkabetz. We know that Shlomo Alkabetz wrote it because he wrote his name into it. If you read the first letter of each of the paragraphs, it spells out Shlomo Halevi, which was his name. So he signed his work by literally writing his name into the poem. Very clever. He's a brilliant author for so many reasons, not just because he could fit his name into his poetry, but also because he weaves verses mostly taken from the works of Isaiah, but other places as well, and you'll see citations on the page. He takes words of Isaiah and mystical concepts to try and give us a sense of hope and a sense of aspiring for what Shabbat should be doing for us and how we should be feeling uplifted. Throughout, especially the Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages after the Inquisition had destroyed the great Spanish and Portuguese communities, there was a desperate need for a feeling of some form of success, some form of happiness, some form of joy that could make up for the catastrophe that had been unfolding. And the communities that were in Sfat, which had many members that had come from those exiles, they created some of these poems that did exactly that. So when it talks about coming up out of the valley of tears, when it talks about shaking off the dust, when it talks about opening your eyes, being awake, seeing the light, and expecting deliverance from the son of Jesse, which is a metaphor for David, meaning the Messiah, it all fits together. And this was an expectation that they had that on Shabbat they would they would allow themselves to dare to dream on Shabbat. And so this song really allows that feeling of hope and anticipation to come pouring out in a way that during the 6 days of regular work and toil, they might not have let themselves do. There are, like I said, 1,000 different melodies for Lecha Dodi. You'll probably have heard the one that goes, Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabla, Lecha Dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabla. And you just repeat that in different versions on each of the different stanzas. There are 1,000 YouTubes out there that sing all of these in many different versions with people who sing much better than me. At the end of Lecha Dodi, however, which finishes on page 25, the last stanza begins with the phrase, Boi v'shalom ateret bala, come in peace, the crown of your husband, of her husband. And during this stanza, we literally stand up and we literally turn to the entrance of the synagogue as we are literally, metaphorically, welcoming Shabbat into our midst. The same way they used to go out into the fields and watch the darkness spread across as Shabbat came, we are at least turning and physically greeting Shabbat as though she were a bride walking down the aisle to join us at this point of the service. It's customary as well that mourners not enter the synagogue until this point. If somebody is just having come from buried a loved one that week, they're still experiencing Shiva, that period of mourning, then they stay in the lobby until after this song, because they're not ready for hope and daring to dream and all of these songs of joy. They're still hurting. And since this is all technically optional, they're not doing anything wrong by sitting outside. Good. Which is why you'll see on page 26, there is an official greeting to those that are coming as mourners. And then we reach on page 27, Psalm 92. Now, Psalm 92 is officially called Mizmor Shir Leyom HaShabbat, right? This is a psalm. It is a song for the day of Shabbat. And that is the last time you hear the word Shabbat in the entire poem, which is a little weird. So why is it that in the book of Psalms, 3,000 years ago when they were being written, when they wanted to label a psalm as being, this is the one for Shabbat, why pick this one? Well, we don't have the original editor's notes because, those were left behind. But the understanding is that if you read Psalm 92, it is, again, this reassurance that although it may look like the world around us has problems, which it does, and it may look like temporarily during, the middle of the week that bad people are sometimes doing just fine and good people are not doing so fine, in the long scope of things, something that you can only see when you stop, look up, and breathe, you can see that in the long term, the righteous are going to continue to flourish and the bad are eventually going to fade away. Right? That the comparison is made between different plants, that the wicked are like grass, it comes up and it goes away. But the righteous are like cedars or date palms, which take a long time to grow, but they grow strong and they keep going for a long, long time. And that is the image that we're supposed to be able to hold on to when we reach Shabbat. That sometimes we don't notice that during the week, right? During the week, we're too busy about just paying the bills and getting things done. But on Shabbat, when we breathe, we can say, I know that there are a lot of crazies out there and a lot of people who aren't so nice, but long term, they're actually losing. And long time, there are more nice people now than there are bad people. Sometimes it's hard to remember that because the nice people don't always make it onto the news. But on average, most people in the world are nice. And on average, nice people are getting stronger because if they weren't, the whole world would look very, very different. It would look like it did 1,000 years ago. And I need to remember that. And I need to be hopeful that it's going to continue to move in that direction. And that lets me breathe. And that lets me enjoy Shabbat in a way that I wouldn't if I didn't have that image. If I didn't recognize that God's creation does have a destination and that destination is better than where we've been. It doesn't mean that there aren't setbacks. It doesn't mean that, sometimes we have to retake territory that we have lost, but the overall pattern is an upwards one. And this is trying to get us to see that pattern on Shabbat in a way that we can't do during the days of the week. Similarly, when we do Psalm 93, which is found on page 29, we are trying to hear the sound of God above the crash of the oceans. The oceans are usually used in biblical poetry as a metaphor for chaos. When it says the world is set firm upon the waters, what it's basically saying is that although the world may seem chaotic, God has made it stable. Right? It's not that there's actually rivers under the water, or under the earth, although here in Florida there pretty much are water everywhere you dig. But the idea being that God has made a stable universe out of chaos, which happens to be both scientifically true as well as metaphorically true. And certainly what we see in the beginning of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, where it says that God made the world even though it was tohu vavohu, even though it was chaos and void. And that brings us to an end of Kabbalat Shabbat. Question? Okay, now if you are in an
Yes, I have a question. Okay, we're talking about the Psalms and the songs.
Yes,
What about the prayers?
we're coming to them. So the songs and psalms, as I mentioned at the beginning, are technically optional. So if for some reason you are in an absolute rush, don't know why you'd be rushing, it's Shabbat, you should be relaxing. But if you had to, you could not do what we've just discussed. Right? Those sections are technically optional. Now they've become almost obligatory because they've been adopted by all the Jewish communities, but they are not technically a mitzvah. They're not technically a commandment for us to do. Following this, we usually put a little break in. We usually do a little bit of study. Now, in the traditional world, let me just flip forward, we do a little study of Mishnah, taken from Mishnah Shabbat, chapter 2 onwards, and it discusses how you light the Shabbat candles. And this is a good reminder, as well as a wonderful metaphor for what the light of Shabbat means. You can technically study anything. And in our own congregation, this is why we do the sermon at this point in the service. It's then followed up by the Mourner's Kaddish, which, as we've talked about, I think before, but I will repeat it 100 times, the Kaddishes are generally included as a way to put a small break in the section of a service before we move to a new section of service. So you have section A, you do a Kaddish, and then you do a section B. And this allows us to see that there are different parts of a service. So every time you get to a Kaddish, you have to say, something just happened, right? And if it's a major change, then we usually do what is called a Kaddish Shalem. But that usually only comes when we have done a major section of prayer. This didn't have any major prayers in it because there were no prayers. It was just psalms and songs. And so we do Kaddish Yatom, the Mourner's Kaddish, which is a one-line abbreviation of the Kaddish Shalem. We take out one sentence and it shortens it a little bit, and we give it as an honor to those who are in mourning. Following that, we then move on to the Mariv service, which begins at the Baruch Hu on page number 39. And you can look at page 39, the first blessing, which is taken from a different part of our history. But the most common version is the one that's on 39a, and that's the one that we use. So this section, Mariv, is structured just like any other weekday Mariv service at this point. Right? We don't have anything different here because it's Shabbat. Like I said, this Siddur does include some options of making things different for Shabbat, for some of these prayers that were found in other ancient Siddurim and other ancient prayer books. We generally, however, will use the versions that have been common now for a few hundred years, which are the same versions that you'll see on a regular weekday. And that begins with Baruch Hu, which is our call to worship, where the leader calls out to everyone to give blessing to God, and then, of course, everyone will do that blessing. And that is done only when we have a minyan, which is a quorum of 10 adults. Everyone good? Following that, the second half of page 39a, where it says the first bracha before the Shema, the coming of evening light. This is also known as Ma'ariv Aravim. This is the blessing where we thank God for the alternation between day and night, where we say, night is a blessing. Right? Night is not a curse. Darkness is not bad. There is nothing evil about blackness. Right? It's okay for the sun to go down, because when the sun goes down, a new day begins. And that is something, that cycle of day and night, of week after week, of months, of seasons, of years, is something that we thank God as having given us. And it's also symbolic of thanking God for the gift of all of creation itself. Make sense? Maybe? Good. Now this has a slightly different nusach, a slightly different melody set that goes with it. So if you look at this at the bottom, you see a little triangle, maybe near the bottom in both the English as well as the Hebrew. That's usually where the leader will start chanting out loud. A reminder that Jewish prayer is first and foremost an individual obligation, but we usually also appoint a leader to help keep everybody moving, as well as to help people who don't know how to do the prayers on their own. So there's always a combination of quiet, do it on your own, and out loud, either sing with or follow the leader. And the melody for this section goes like this. Uma'avir yom u'me'evi laila, umavtil bein yom u'bein laila, Adonai tzivahot shemo, El chai v'kayam, tamid yimloch aleinu le'olam va'ed, Baruch ata Adonai, ha'ma'ariv ha'ravim. And that melody is used for other portions of the service that we will cover in the next few pages. If you turn to the next page, which is page 40, remember we're skipping the optional page 39b, we get to the second blessing, the second bracha. And this one is known as Ahavat Olam, which is the first two words of the Hebrew. And this one is a thankfulness for God for the gift of Torah. But the gift of Torah is not just Torah, the Torah is love. But because God loved us, he gave us Torah. Because like any parent who loves their children, they will give them instruction, which is what Torah is. They will give guidance. And this means that the world that we just described in our first blessing, which is so beautiful, but also overwhelming, can make sense. That with the Torah, we can understand our place, our purpose, and our path in this world. And so these two blessings fit together very nicely. In the morning, we do Ahava Rabbah, which has the same theme, just with slightly different emphasis. I'm not going to sing this whole version because I don't want to run out of time. So we're going to turn to page, we're going to turn to page 41. Let's turn off that ringer. We're going to turn to page 41, and you'll see that after doing Ahavat Olam and thanking God for the loving gift of Torah, we then can recognize that through the gift of creation and through the gift of revelation of Torah, that we can see there is only one God. And of course, in Judaism, we say that by saying the Shema. Right? Listen up, Israel. Adonai Eloheinu, God. Adonai is our God. And Adonai, this Lord, this God we're talking about, Echad, is one. Right? The one that made all this, the universe, the one that made the Torah, it's all one God. Right? It's not one God for trees and one God for dogs and one God for rainbows. It's all the same. And the God that did all of that is also the God that revealed Torah to us, and the God that loves us, which is why we follow by saying ve'ahavta, and we will love God. Notice, very important, God loved us first, and we are now responding with our own love. Right? God loved us enough to make the world and us, and God loved us enough to tell us how we can live a good life in that world. You know what? That's worthy of me loving a little bit back. And so we respond with the ve'ahavta of us loving God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, and with all of our might, our means, whatever which way you want to describe it, and talking about some of the basic ways that we will remember God. And then that continues on page 42 with the next two main paragraphs, where we talk about how as a community we will have a connection to God and feel the influence for both good as well as for negative things as a community. And then the final paragraph is about how we remind ourselves through the wearing of the tzitzit, the fringes on our talit, that we have this connection to God, that we are literally tied to God. And we had a whole session on talit and tefillin a few weeks ago. Well, more than a few weeks ago now. So we finish on the bottom of page 42 by ending the last paragraph and beginning the next prayer all together. 42. So at the very bottom, you see it says Adonai Elohechem. That's the end of the third paragraph of the Sheman Ve'ahavta. And then it finishes with the word emet. And that is the first word of the next blessing. And we blend them together so that we say Adonai Elohechem emet. Why do we do that? Well, we do that to say that the truth, which is what the word emet means, that we have just said, is going to lead us to the true understanding in the next blessing on page 42, page 43, as well as 44, 43a and 44, which is that God is a redeemer. Right? We have the idea of creation, we had the idea of revelation, and now we have the idea of redemption. And it all is linked together. God created a world, God explained the world. Together with us and our love of God and our commitment to God's ways, the world will be redeemed. The world will be fixed. It will be made perfect. It will be made whole. That this is possible. And this is something that, of course, we do on every time we pray, whether it be morning or night, weekdays or holidays. This pattern is repeated over and over again. And that continues, like I said, 43a as well as 44. On 44, you may find the part that's a little more familiar to many people, the Mi Chamocha. The Mi Chamocha B'Helim Adonai, which is a quote that's taken from when we had left Egypt and we had just walked through the sea, and Moses and Miriam and everyone else began singing. Wow, that was a kind of special event. We all following so far? Okay, 45, we get another blessing called the Hashkivenu. So we had two blessings before the Shema, and now we've had two blessings after the Shema. And this fourth blessing, and we only do 4 in the evening on weekdays and Shabbat, this fourth blessing of Hashkivenu is asking for peace, is asking for protection. This is our way of saying, I know we just finished saying that night was okay and darkness isn't scary, but it still is a little scary, right? Because I'm letting go of being awake. I'm letting go of being on guard. I'm moving into my ultimate state of vulnerability, which we call sleep. Please, God, stay with me, right? Help me wake up in the morning. Help our communities be safe. Help us be able to be strong. Help us have peace. And that's what the theme of Hashkivenu is all about. Good? Good. Page 46, we then get to Vishamru. And Vishamru is a special edition for Shabbat. Now, Vishamru is taken from the book of Exodus. It is Exodus 31. And it is reminding us that when God gave us Shabbat, it wasn't just, I have this thing called Shabbat, but that Shabbat was going to be a special link between us and the day that would reflect our special link between us and God. That Shabbat in and of itself is a sign, an oath of our link to God and God's link to us. And so when we celebrate Shabbat, it's not just about keeping Shabbat and doing Shabbat and making Shabbat. It is about having that symbol be living between us and God as part of our relationship. So you'll find that most people will sing Vishamru with a lot of energy. It's a very peppy song. I'm not going to go through the version now because we're running out of time. Because we've now finished the main chunk, we have a Kaddish, right? Like I said, we've finished now section B. We're just about ready to begin section C, and that means we need to have a Kaddish. But because we don't like putting a big break between the Shema and its blessings and the next section, which is called the Amidah, we just do a Chatzi Kaddish, which is the shortest version of Kaddish that we have. But then we continue on page 47, all the way through page 52. And this is the Amidah. Now, every main service will always have an Amidah. The Amidah is the heart of the service. We have prepared ourselves by welcoming Shabbat. We have prepared ourselves by understanding God's world, God's Torah, God's love, our love, and the path for redemption and hopefully also peace. Now, we hopefully have our mind in the right place. We can stand in front of God and open up our mouth and open up our heart. They're probably here for the 7 o'clock meeting. Yep. Gareth, would you mind opening the door for Jess? He's early. Thank you. So the Amidah means literally standing. So as you can guess, we're already standing for this prayer. But this is meant to be the most intimate conversation. And during the evening, we do this privately, meaning this is a conversation that is said each person between me and God. We don't do this as a community. It is just said each person to themselves. But as always, we say it, meaning it's not just something you read in your head. You should be moving your lips along with this. And in case you haven't heard me say this before, do it in the language you understand. Eventually, hopefully, that will be Hebrew if you're not there yet. Hebrew is, I believe, the most poetic language for prayer and many other ideas, but better to do it in English or Spanish or Greek or Russian or any other language that you understand than to do it in a language that is meaningless to you. Now, can Hebrew be meaningful even if you don't understand it? Yes, because it is a connection between us and our history. It is a connection between us and Jews around the world. It's a connection between us and the language God chose to express himself to us with. But it is still best if you understand what it actually means. And so if you're going to do it in Hebrew, make sure you have learned enough to at least know the theme of what that Hebrew relates to. Because that needs to be linked together. So like I said, between pages 47 and 52, we do that privately. I should point out that this is taking, the explanation is taking about as long as the actual service. A Friday night service, even with all of the songs, is usually about an hour long. And that also includes a sermon. So doing it privately on your own or doing it, quickly with the community, you can easily do it in 40 minutes or less. Depends how long the rabbi is going to talk. But this class is taking longer than the service itself would. Page 53, we get to the concluding prayers. Right? Once we finish the Amidah, we are officially done with the official service, with the actual requirements of the service. But over time, the communities around the world added extra elements to help us wind down, to help us slowly come back to earth, if you will. And also because we liked lingering. There was also a very practical reason, which is sometimes people who were coming from the fields or wherever they were working would arrive late for the beginning parts of the service, and they would not have caught up by the time we finished the Amidah. So if the majority of the people were done and they all left, then the stragglers would be left on their own and they would walk home alone. And that was not considered nice. It also wasn't considered safe. And so they added some of these additional concluding passages as a way of helping the community finish together so that we could all walk home in the dark on Shabbat at the same time. One of the ones we use is Vayachulu. Vayachulu is a beautiful celebration of God's capstone of creation, the creation of Shabbat. It is taken straight from the book of Genesis, from Bereshit, from chapter 2. And Vayachulu is usually recited while we're standing because we are essentially acting as witnesses. We are saying, God made all of this. Now, we've had discussions before about the non-hyper-literalism of 6 days of creation. It wasn't 6 24-hour days that God made the world in, but the idea that the world is part of a fabulous tapestry of creation and that there is a creator behind the whole universe, that is the theme of Vayachulu, and we are giving testimony that we indeed believe that. We follow that up in the middle of 53 and to its conclusion of 53 and the start of 54, with a mini repetition of the Amidah. During the regular weekday service and often on Saturday mornings and other times, we will do a repetition of the Amidah. For the benefit of those who really don't know the Hebrew, really don't know how to pray, we will go back and repeat the whole thing for their benefit. In the evening, we never do that, right? On Sunday through Thursday night, we never do a repetition of the evening service. On holidays, we never do a repetition of the evening service. But on Shabbat, again, for the benefit of the stragglers, as well as those who maybe didn't know quite how to do it on their own, we do a pseudo-repetition. It has many of the same words and many of the same themes woven together into a 3-paragraph summary version. It's the Cliff Notes or what do they call them? Spark Notes version of what we did in the Amidah. And this, again, allows people to catch on to what the ideas are meant to be, and also for other people to catch up. Okay? Okay. Many different melodies. It's lovely. And then we get to page 54. Like I said, that third paragraph is still part of the mini repetition. And then we hit Kaddish Shalem. Why is it Kaddish Shalem? Because we finished the major section. And it's the full Kaddish because we did the Amidah. We did that section of our most intimate standing prayer. Seeing the pattern a little bit? I know, it takes a lot to get used to, but the good thing is it's the same every week. And really, this structure is the same every day with a few variations because it's Shabbat, which means it's not hard to get used to it. And that's by design. I know some people think the Jewish prayer is repetitive, but so is saying I love you to your spouse every night. And that doesn't mean that you should stop saying it just because you said it yesterday and just because you want to say it tomorrow. If it was true yesterday and it's true tonight, you want to keep saying it. And using the same words rather than struggling to try and figure out a new expression allows sometimes the emotion to flow even more easily than otherwise would happen. If any of you have ever sat down and thought, I'm going to write a poem for someone, it's really hard to come up with all the words you want to say. On the other hand, if there's something you've already said that really summarized it, use it again, right? Because it worked once and it really moved you and it moved the person that you were talking to. Those words worked. And we as Jews, we stick with the words that work. Sometimes it takes a little work to understand why they work, but that's part of Jewish study. After Kaddish Shalem, we do the Kiddush, page 55. Now the Kiddush is also a home ritual. It is something that we do at our dinner table. The Kiddush is the prayer that we say while holding a cup of wine. We are technically sanctifying Shabbat. We are declaring that Shabbat is holy, and we do it over a cup of wine as a symbol of gladness and joy. That this is not a burden that Shabbat is holy. This is something to celebrate. And for humanity, having a day of rest indeed has been a blessing for all of the world. For us, of course, the spirituality of Shabbat is a bonus beyond just being able to sit and rest for 24 hours. Like I said, the Kiddush is done at dinner, but it's also done in the synagogue. It originally was being done in the synagogue because there were people who were travelers, and the synagogues of old used to also be like hotels, that travelers would stay in the synagogue, and since they had no home to go to for their own dinner, they would say Kiddush during the service to make sure that they also could have the Kiddush. After the Kiddush, we do Aleinu, which is how the Ashkenazim, the European Jews, finish every service. That's page 56 and page 57. And this prayer, which is very, very old, and originally part of the High Holiday service, became part of the daily services as a way of celebrating our unique destiny. The Aleinu says, you know what, God, you've made all sorts of people around the world and all types, but I'm glad I'm Jewish. But specifically, I'm glad I'm Jewish because, especially in the ancient world, they all worshipped idols and rivers and the sun, but you helped us understand what was important and what was good. Thank you, right? That I have the privilege of having been lucky enough to know that at this point in my life and to be part of a people, the Jewish people who know that. And I hope, and this is page 57, it's my hope that the whole world will eventually understand this too. So this is the most universal aspect of Judaism in our prayers, of the second paragraph of Aleinu, where we say we hope that the entire world won't become Jewish. I mean, they can if they want, but that they will at least understand that we all come from the same God and that sticks and stones are not things that we should be worshiping, nor should we be worshiping money or power. And it should just be us connecting to God. And if we all connect to God, we'll connect to each other peacefully too. And then all of us will realize that we are children of the same God, and that God only has really one name, and that name is shared by all of us. And the Aleinu then brings the formal service to a conclusion. However, we just finished another section, and that means page 58, another Kaddish. But there was no Amidah, there was no standing prayer, and so we do the slightly shorter version, which is reserved for the mourners, the Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. See how that pattern works out? Okay. But because we hate running away before, too early. We'll usually add an additional song. Sometimes people will sing Adon Olam. But on Friday night, it's also become very customary to sing a song called Yigdal, page 62, which I consider to be my favorite song about philosophy. And not a lot of them. Yigdal is a poetry version of Rambam, Maimonides' 13 principles that are meant to be at the core of our Jewish belief. Someone took his very long essay and turned it into 13 lines of poetry, which is really, really hard. And the guy did a great job at it. But remember that this is a whole essay that he's trying to condense. So it's good to study the whole version. That was our first class. If you were here, or if you have checked back to our first YouTube video, we went over those 13 principles in more detail. But Yigdal allows us to finish by saying, as I go out into the world, these are some of the core things I need to still believe and still need to understand about how all of this works. And that is a Friday night service on one leg. Questions? All right, as always, questions are welcome by email, phone, text, carrier pigeon, smoke signal.
I just am curious. I came here for the first Friday dinner Shabbat.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You were on vacation.
Yep.
So,
Yep. I wasn't here.
So I came in. I was curious because I'm used to the Orthodox that they
Mhm.
light up candles. Over here, they do. Nobody light up.
Well, so usually during most of the year, the services will begin too late and the time will have already passed. And so it's generally our pattern not to light the candles if we're not, if it would be too late, because most of the time it would be too late, we don't do it at any time during the year. Additionally, there's a debate about whether you need to light candles if it's in a place that you're not actually living. It's not your kitchen, it's not your house, it's not your apartment, and lighting candles is fine. Whether or not you say a blessing is also a question. Whether or not you really need those candles is another question if you're using electric lights. So it's not required to have candles for a service. It's okay to do so, but it's not required. And definitely when you get into the winter, your services are going to be starting at like 4:30 if you want to light candles, because otherwise you've got a problem. No matches.
No matches. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good that you're paying attention. All right. See you all next week.
Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thank you.